Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think we will wait one more minute before we start to have a critical mass of attendees, so please bear with us. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning on the East Coast. My name is Daniel Hegedűs. I work as Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and lead the Central Europe programming of GMF. And I am really delighted to chair this AUTHLIB workshop today. AUTHLIB is a Horizon research project kindly supported by the European Commission and the UK Research and Innovation Programme. And the abbreviation actually stands for Neo-Authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response. Within the AUTHLIB consortium, we investigate actually different aspects of illiberalism, autocratization, but one of our work packages, and actually the one our today paper relates to, focuses on illiberals in power and their impact at various policies, including foreign policy as well. We have three distinguished speakers today. Erin Jani, Professor for International Relations at the Central European University, and Mehmet Yavuz, PhD researcher at CEU, who are the authors of the today's paper, and also Dean Schaefer, postdoctoral researcher at CEU, who will serve as our discussant today. And having two hats, I will also chime in with some comments on the policy relevance of the topics and the findings. Regarding the run of the show, Erin and Mehmet will present their research and their findings in approximately 20 minutes, followed by the interventions of Dean and myself in approximately 10 minutes. And after giving the opportunity to Erin and Mehmet to respond, we would like to open up the Q&A part of the panel approximately after an hour. And I very much would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to submit your questions or comments either in the Q&A section or in the chat function of Zoom. I also would like to inform you that the event is recorded and will be available online at the YouTube channel of AUTHLIB. And having said that, I would like to immediately give the floor to Erin and Mehmet.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And we'd like to thank the Democracy Institute and the German Marshall Fund for providing us this opportunity to share our findings and our work on populist foreign policy, comparing the two cases of Hungary and Austria. This project is part of a larger project of, investigating foreign policy rhetoric and the extent to which nationalism, populism, and the merging of the two, what we call ethnopopulism, is increasing, decreasing, how they compare relative to other countries. And so we have a larger kind of textual analysis that Mehmet will talk about. And then we'll drill into the comparative case study. Okay, so a little bit about the motivation for our project. So first of all, there is a small but growing and robust literature on populist foreign policy, what may be called PFP. And basically what this is an expression of popular sovereignty in a state's external relations. And what we're trying to do is get at whether or not populist parties alter their rhetoric on foreign policy topics when they're in government as opposed to opposition. This is the kind of the broader question that we're looking at. And we're also motivated by the fact that there's a lack of systematic, longitudinal and cross-sectional evidence about these two ideologies. Typically, you see nationalism or a focus on populism, but you don't really see how they compare relative to one another. And then we also don't look at how they are reflected in foreign policy communication by the main governing parties in European countries. And finally, we thought that the EU countries of Hungary and Austria offer a relatively tight controlled comparison of comparable EU countries that were affected by similar sort of sovereign shocks to their systems, and that but that basically sort of converged in their foreign policy talk despite their different foreign policy orientations. So this is a method of most different systems design, one of Mill's comparative methods. And so what we want to do here using qualitative and quantitative data is look to see whether populist governance changes the way these particular mainstream parties talk about a small number of foreign policy topics, which Mehmet will talk about. So first, I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is actually the main figure in a chapter co-authored by myself and Cameron Thies that came out in the Oxford Handbook on Foreign Policy, actually just came out a couple months ago, looking at or theorizing the ways in which populism and nationalism independently and in interactive form impact on foreign policy. And so the way that we're thinking about it is actually that there are certain shocks to the state society that are perceived either as being a threat to internal sovereignty, right? So let's say kind of campaign finance scandals, something that's going to affect the extent to which the people have a say in government, as opposed to sort of threats to external sovereignty, such as, you know, the refugee crisis of 2015. And these have kind of differential impacts on the ways that sort of societies mobilize. The first is more likely to look like a populist mobilization, and the second more like nationalist mobilization with an emphasis on territorial sovereignty as opposed to popular sovereignty. And then when they co-combine, then they produce something known as ethnopopulism, where you see both kind of populist and nationalist mobilization kind of appear in the rhetoric. And we would expect these foreign policy impacts to be more kind of systemic conflict, sort of this fight against the establishment with populist mobilization, so fight against the EU, Brussels, and so on. Conflict with neighbors, maybe allies with nationalist mobilizations, and then with ethnopopulist mobilization is something that I've called omni-conflict. This is something that I wrote about in International Affairs a couple of years ago, where you see conflict both with the neighboring countries and with international institutions. And some of this is performative, but very often there are genuine policy impacts that we see from this, as we'll see in a second. So what does our paper look like? So basically, we have this mixed methods research design. We call Hungary and Austria kind of like tough tests, following Harry Eckstein's discussion of tough tests as a logic of case selection for populist nationalist impacts on foreign policy. It's tough because, you know, there's so many constraints on EU member countries, especially small countries. So it's difficult to carve out, conflictual foreign policies, when we're talking about these types of countries. So if we can see it here, then we're likely to see it also in other places. So this is the Frank Sinatra principle of tough tests. So there are three different steps. And I'm going to ask Mehmet to jump in here in a second. So the first is an analysis of national security strategy documents using a technique called word embeddings, which Mehmet will talk about. We included a number of other countries in this analysis because there were only a few documents that Austria and Hungary produced. So it made more sense to look at them in context with other EU countries, what their national security strategy documents look like. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, not too much, about the qualitative case comparison of Orbán, the prime minister, and chair of Fidesz, and his prime ministership from 2010, and the ÖVP chair, which had his prime minister Sebastian Kurz with like 2 terms of prime ministership. But so we see a punctuated populist governance in Austria, but you see a kind of a consistent sort of continuity of populist governance in Hungary. So we're kind of also looking to see whether there are trends in the rhetoric that you can see. And I'm going to say a couple things about the impact, namely on the UN Global Compact on migration, which both of these countries took a very hostile position on after originally, at least in the case of Austria, looking kind of more favorably about it. And then I think I'm going to let Mehmet talk about step 3 and maybe sort of like circle back a little bit to talk about the method itself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. So about the method itself, I'm not going to get into technical details, but essentially the text analysis methods that you have seen before probably usually focus on documents as a whole. So let's say they analyze how many times the word immigration occurs in a document. What we do here with word embeddings is a little bit different. They look at distance of the words to each other within documents. So here we are not interested in how many times they talk about migration, but whether the term illegal is closer to migration than the word assistance. So this is the main advantage of our strategy, where we try to analyze words in a systematic manner by the company of words they keep. And to be able to do that, essentially, we come up with a list of populist terms, nationalist terms, and ethno-nationalist terms, and then compare it with some target terms, which we will discuss when I show you the graphs. Importantly, for the analysis of national security strategy documents, we also include some countries as a baseline, and these are all the AUTHLIB countries, to be able to analyze Austria and Hungary comparatively. And the parliamentary speeches, we essentially analyze how ÖVP MPs and Fidesz-KDNP MPs discourse changed over time. And we have data since 1996. So we start from there to show also the time trends. And this consists around 72,000 speeches, actually. And a little bit about data. So national security strategy documents are rather published sporadically in most European countries, but this is what we have. So from Hungary, for example, we have 3 documents, 2004, 12, and 20. In Austria, actually, we don't have any document that was published by the ÖVP Kurz coalition. So the latest one that was published in 2013. And importantly, for this analysis, we analyze each paragraph, not document itself, because each paragraph in national security strategy documents essentially makes separate arguments. So these are very compact documents. And when analyzing this, we also consider their legal former nature. We take this into account. So for example, words like betrayal and people, like betrayal and elite, are usually words that we can associate with populism. But in these cases, in this very formal documents, we focus on words such as independence and respect, which are not necessarily very heavy political discourses, but still, if these words are associated with the word, for example, Europe, compared to other documents, this indicates more revisionism. That's what we think. And so importantly, if we look, we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 documents that are published by illiberal governments. So in 2001, this is the first FPÖ coalition. And in Poland, we have the PiS governments. In Hungary, the Fidesz governments. We can skip this one, I think. So what we have here is essentially the similarity levels of, so how much the words populist, nationalist, and ethno-populist words are associated with the term European Union. And this enables us to scale documents on how populist, how nationalist they are. And we also colored the graphs based on whether this is a Central Eastern European country and Western European country to see if there are any systematic differences. So just, I will talk a bit about that. So what we see here, first of all, we don't find any significant difference between Central Eastern European countries and Western European countries. So this is something we expected, but did not find after all. Maybe in the case of nationalism, we see that actually Central Eastern European countries use a little bit more nationalist discourse when talking about EU. But other than that, we don't see any significant regional patterns. Well, when it comes to ethnopopulism, which is really a populist discourse that collapses nation and people, but also emphasizes sovereignty, Hungary is the leading actor. So this is something we expect. But the second point, which is important, is that we don't also see a very clear illiberal distinction. For example, France 2013 document is just tiny bit less ethnopopulist than the Hungary document. And importantly, we also see time trends, and we can show it, I think, with the next slide. So, I mean, we generally see an increase in ethnopopulist framing, but I think this is really prominent in Hungary. The documents that were published by early Fidesz governments are less ethnopopulist compared to the ones that were published later, which also shows that this is a matter of sovereign shocks. So they are populist, sure, but they use more populist discourse once they exercise some sovereign shocks, and in this case, the refugee crisis. So in 2012 document, for example, the document mentions that Hungary will contribute to a strong NATO and European Union. As opposed to that, in the 2020 document, we see that they talk about EU not as a federation, but as an alliance of an integration of sovereign nation states. So the sovereignist discourse really is there in 2020 document, and in 2012 document we see more the Hungary is framed as a state that is more cooperative and more internationalist. So this is, I think, a sharp change over time. And then, so the previous graphs were about European Union. These graphs are about migration. So we wanted to see if there are systematic differences between countries, how they talk about migration, and whether they use more or less illiberal discourse. So in these cases, we look at terms such as illegal threats and compare their association with the term migration across documents. Hungary 2022, which has been, since the start of the presentation, has been the most illiberal document, is still again the leading document. And you can see that it is actually significantly more illiberal compared to other documents. So this is one finding. But again, we would like to note that there is no clear illiberal distinction. So the Czech 2023 document was produced by the anti-populist government that actually, which was a coalition that brought down Babiš. But still we see illiberal migration discourse there as well. One important thing, if you look at the documents that are at the top, majority of them are produced after the 2015 refugee crisis. So we also see a time trend. And again, this, I think, shows us that illiberal discourses, populist discourses becomes much more intensified when there's a sovereign shock. So it's not about the actors themselves necessarily, but as we depicted in our theory, it's about sovereign shocks, really. Yes, we can skip this, I think.
Maybe I'll jump in here quickly on the comparative evidence. I don't want to talk in too much detail about this, but there is some clear evidence, we believe, that this type of foreign policy rhetoric that increased, especially populist and ethnopopulist foreign policy rhetoric on migration can be seen to be reflected also in the foreign policy choices by the two governments. So in Hungary, it's a little bit clearer. We don't actually talk about this too much in the paper, but you know, in the pre-2015 period, you had Orbán, his foreign policy rhetoric, Fidesz MPs, their foreign policy rhetoric really was focused much more on kind of like the IMF, on, you know, arable land, on the kinds of the ways in which, you know, the Brussels is interfering with Hungarian sovereignty. And after the refugee crisis, basically you see, you know, the EU being looped into these kinds of conspiracies together with Soros about how, you know, they're planning to settle millions of refugees from Middle East and North Africa on the territory of Hungary. And so I think there was no question that the Hungarian government would vote against the GCM in 2018 when the UN held a vote. I think it's interesting in this respect that there are only 5 countries that voted against the GCM. And just briefly, the GCM essentially is kind of like a series, it's a sort of non-binding convention or international compact on, you know, signatory states' willingness to come together and work together to come up with a more sort of like a just and equitable and sort of security promoting migration regime. The countries that voted against it included Hungary, the Czech Republic, Israel, the US, and Poland. Right. So, and you had basically right-wing populist governments in each of those countries at the time. So I think that there's a clear connection between, you know, this type of shock, but also having these parties in power at the time and their vote against the GCM. 152 countries voted in favor of the GCM. So this is a almost overwhelming affirmative vote in favor of the GCM that only a few countries voted against or abstained. Now, Austria was one of the countries that chose to abstain among a group of 12 other countries. And at this point, I think it's very interesting to note that Sebastian Kurz, who had been a foreign minister under the previous government, together ÖVP with SPÖ, so the Social Democrats, basically said very positive things about the GCM and was working in favor of negotiating a conclusion to this compact. He said, if immigrants find a job and contribute to our societies, then integration can be a win-win situation for all of us. We need to join forces. No country has a capacity and resources to take in unlimited numbers of migrants. This is a global challenge and a shared responsibility. So there's a lot of multilateralism in this kind of statement. And this contrasts then with FPÖ. When FPÖ came together as a junior partner in the 2017 to 2019 coalition government with the ÖVP, with Sebastian Kurz now as prime minister, no longer as foreign minister, the FPÖ, meanwhile, had been mobilizing on social media. It was basically calling the GCM a kind of shot across the bow against Austrian sovereignty and Austrian self-determination. And it represented external control through the back door. It was a pact of the devil, would have fatal consequences, explicitly labeling migrants as illegal and irregular. And then, of course, the well-worn boogeyman of Soros comes up again. And in the end, in this 2018 vote, you know, the government basically just chose to abstain from the vote, right? So, you know, it wasn't a reject, but it was clearly kind of a statement, right? And in the second Kurz government, with the Greens, which were very sort of pro kind of like we should help refugees, we should, you know, work with other countries to come up with a multilateral solution. This did not change Kurtz's position on the GCM. He basically stuck with this position that he had been kind of pushed into by Heinz Christian Strache, who was the chair and junior coalition party of the FPÖ under the previous government. So this again shows how these shocks can push sort of a process in motion that kind of can continue and have these kind of continuing ongoing repercussions, even into a liberal period of governance in that country. So Mehmet?
So here, what you see is the analysis of parliamentary speeches. In this x-axis, you see the year, and in the y-axis, you see how much each discourse is associated with populist migration. So this is the analysis of migration based on parliamentary speeches. And here, I will just briefly mention the key takeaways. There are two things. First, presence of illiberal actors in power indeed matters. So if you look at the Fidesz KDNP graph, indeed there are fluctuations of increase, which shows that there is more illiberal discourse, but these only become systematic after 2010. So after 2010, we see a systematic anti-migration discourse, which further intensifies until 2015 and kind of consolidates and becomes more steady. So the fluctuations stop. This shows that, yes, indeed, illiberalism in power matters, and with shocks, they intensify. And similarly, in the case of ÖVP, we see that there are increases and decreases over time, but once Kurz becomes foreign minister, this further solidifies. In this graph, however, what we see is that who is the illiberal actor and how illiberal they are also matters. So because we see a pattern of increase in Fidesz when it comes to Europe, so they talk about Europe in a more populist way, which is a perfect case of revisionism. But with ÖVP, we see a steady, systematic pattern. And in fact, if we compare these two countries, for example, in 2018, Fidesz uses 30% more ethno-populist discourse compared to ÖVP. So we also have to understand the nuanced differences between two cases and should not equalize them. I think this is our takeaway. We can move to the last one, I think. So this is something we would like to really hear your opinions. So in this case, we analyze the sentiments associated with the term Europe and Russia in both parliamentary speeches. So if they use more positive language when talking about Europe and Russia, and here the perfect case of revisionism would mean that, Russia is framed more and more positively over time, and Europe is framed more and more negatively over time. We don't necessarily see that. So in the case of Fidesz, indeed, we see more negative discourse, which is actually lower values about Europe, but we don't necessarily see a significant increase when talking about Russia. However, it is important that after 2018, we see a couple of points where Europe is discussed more negatively than Russia. So this is still remarkable. However, with ÖVP, we don't necessarily see that kind of change, where Europe is always discussed positively and Russia more or less is discussed more negatively. But the good thing, at least, is that after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the discourse towards Russia became much more negative. So there were indeed, between 2018 and 21, in both cases, there was a positive discourse towards Russia, at least compared to the previous years, but this became sharply more negative in 2022. But we would like to explore this a bit more and maybe analyze individual MPs as well. Maybe that's where the pro-Russia discourse is more prominent. So what we find is that on average, illiberal parties use more populist nationalist and their combination ethno-populist discourse, both in their NSS and parliamentary speeches. So this confirms what we really know. And this intensifies after 2015 refugee crisis in the parliamentary speeches. And I think from a broader perspective, as a takeaway, this suggests us that indeed ethnopopulism is a relevant tool to analyze international politics. So we should not just think of it in terms of domestic politics, but also analyze their implications in the foreign policy and take it seriously. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Irene, and thank you so much, Mehmet, for this really very intriguing presentation. And because actually one of AUTHLIB's main goals is to translate and make available the results of cutting-edge academic research for stakeholders and the broader policy community. Actually, we agreed with Dean that that I will proceed now with my comments, which relate to the policy dimension of the paper, and him following up later with rather methodological remarks. And very briefly, I just would like to touch upon 4 thematic areas. First, the populist impact on foreign policy. Second, the role of the crisis in populist policy making. Third, potentially the foreign policy subtopics, which are typically associated with ethnopopulist impact on foreign policy. And fourth, actually the constraints which are imposed by supranational structures like the European Union on national foreign policy making in the European Union, potentially also populist foreign policy making. And in between, I very briefly will also comment on the case selection. So starting with the populist impact on foreign policy. So I think the paper is a very good demonstration that even longitudinal academic research can generate findings which have very high policy relevance, because it actually helps to put ambiguous developments in the right historic perspective, and also understand the trends we are potentially facing also now and in the future. And in that regard, actually, I think for your longitudinal research in the national security strategies and also in the parliamentary speeches actually refers to and also addresses one of the main fundamental puzzles in populism research. And it is actually whether populist parties in power moderate, as was actually stated since the early 2000s, starting with the tradition created by Reinhard Heydrich, or they are actually radicalizing. And obviously a lot of depends from the power position. And I will return to this point again and again, because it very much differs whether a populist radical right party is a minor coalition member of a coalition mostly made up by non-populist parties, or is leading a governing coalition or actually de facto governing alone, how the Hungarian incumbent party Fidesz does. But ultimately, what we see that if populist parties spend significant time in power, they radicalize. And I think some of your findings very clearly speak in that direction. And I think it's very important, and it has to shape also our expectations with regard to other populists in power, which just entered that position actually recently, like in Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, or most recently, the originally left ethno-nationalist populist party Smer in Slovakia, led by Robert Fico, that I think our expectations are right if we suppose that with time these stakeholders will also radicalize, both with regard to their foreign policy performance, but potentially also in other policy areas. My second point here would be that I think it's a very important, again, exchange with the literature. You mentioned this skepticism with regards to populist impact, because a lot of scholars see populism as a sin ideology. We know that it's a part of the minimum definition, and therefore argue that there can be no meaningful effect for foreign policy because populism as a sin ideology is not able to influence foreign policy. And here actually my argument would be, and please let me correct whether you see that in line with your findings or rather challenging it, that populism has a very fundamental structural impact on foreign policy, which is actually very much determined, again, by the power position populist parties occupy. And I think here we can use a parallel, which was created actually by Kaltmasser and Mude. They published a couple of articles in early 2010s actually investigating what are the variables which determine whether populism, or what sort of impact populism has on democracy, whether populism is a corrective to democracy or a threat to democracy. And actually they created a 4-item matrix which argued that largely external factors determine that impact. One, the strengths of the constraints, and second, the power position of the populist parties. And I think in a very similar form, actually the external constraints and the power position of the populist parties determine also what sort of impact they will have on foreign policy making. And I very much like your ethnopopulism definition, which argued that ethnopopulism strives for unconstrained sovereignty of the people nation. Because if we think that further and actually translate it into political realities, it also means that ethnopopulists strive for unconstrained autonomy for the two representatives of the people nation, which is the ethnopopulist party. So ethnopopulism tries to, if in the appropriate power position, strives to deconstruct both domestic and constitutional constraints. And that's the reason why they have an anti-democratic impact, because they attack checks and balances, and because they also try to undermine the external constraints, may it be actually foreign partners or just supranational entities founded in the principles of democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights, like the European Union. And against that background, I think it's inevitable to see that structural foreign policy impact if ethno-nationalists enter that power positions, because that stems from the very fundamental logic of populism. Yes, and I think I will return to that point later when I will briefly also discuss the revisionism of populism and the foreign policy. Second, I found it very intriguing how you try to incorporate the concept of crisis in the foreign policy impact. And you make the statement that ethnopopulist discourses are functions of illiberal governments in power facing external sovereign shocks. And actually, I think what you determine is more or less a correlation, that once there are illiberals in power and there is an external shock, there will be an increase in ethnopopulist rhetoric and narrative. And actually, just again, thinking a bit further your findings, I think one from a policy perspective, very intriguing question is whether in this correlation we see a response to the crisis or actually an active exploitation of the crisis. And here the literature I would like to refer to is, for me, it was really one of the most formative populism research pieces over the past 15 years. That's the Government and Opposition article of Benjamin Moffitt, How to Perform a Crisis. And Moffitt argues that performing crisis and the politics of exceptional circumstances is actually a constitutive element of populist politics. So they don't respond, they perform the crisis and exploit the crisis and perpetuate the crisis, because that's which also ultimately legitimizes through the perceived extraordinary circumstances, the extraordinary ways of exercising power. And obviously this is very strong statement, I think, if we speak about the 2015 migration crisis and the topic of migration. But if we step outside of the migration topic, then we see how actually very artificial crises are invented by populist actors in power to keep that populist mobilization. And actually, I think the best example for that is potentially, if I remember well, the 2022 Tushnet speech of Prime Minister Orbán. Just a couple of months after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And the first time that we have a conventional interstate war since the Second World War on the European continent, actually he started his speech that the main threats to the security of Hungary and the European culture are gender and migration. And the institutionalization of gender and the anti-gender war in the international relations also shows how really invented and artificial these crises and conflicts are from the side of the populists, and are also highlighting that they are not interested in solving crises. They are interested in inventing and perpetuating crises. Coming to my third point, and here even though you mainly focused on migration, I find your paper and findings very refreshing, that there are areas which are low-hanging fruits when one would like to investigate populist impact on foreign policy. And obviously, one such area is migration. It's potentially the most studied and investigated area, and are also foreign and international trade, where one can highlight actually left and right populism have different impact, and therefore populism as a sin ideology potentially is not decisive for foreign policy impact in that areas. But I think if we really would like to demonstrate the populist impact on foreign policy, we should look into the core areas of foreign policy, which means geopolitics, or the relationship to the intergovernmental institutional order, or to the rules-based international order. And you make this step actually with trying to investigate the parliamentary speeches in the dimension of potential foreign policy revisionism. Actually, I was really surprised by the findings that based on your research, there is no clear increase in revisionism. And here potentially some critical points from my end. First, I am not certain whether parliamentary speeches are the most adequate sources for that. So when it comes to Hungary, I definitely would look into the strategic speeches of the charismatic foreign policy leader, and potentially that should be also the most adequate level in the case of other populist parties in power. Because I think parliamentary speeches are still very technocratic, and in much less extent determined by substantial conflicts of this populist dichotomy than really the large strategic speeches of the populist leaders. And I think if you had, for example, looked in that level of documents, then it would be clear the increase in the revisionist language, definitely in the case of Hungary, but potentially also in the case of Poland, and Jarosław Kaczynski. I know that it was not part of the research, and potentially also Hans-Christian Strache or Herbert Kittel in the case of FPÖ. I think what's really interesting here is that populists operate actually with this we versus them dichotomy. So it's always about the concept of enemy. I think we can't expect an increased positive attitude towards Russia or other stakeholders, because even it's not the main argumentative line. The main argumentative line, whom we are defining as the main threat or enemies. And I think here it's a clear increase that the European Union is seen as the main concept of enemy, both in the case of FPÖ and Fidesz, and in the case of the Hungarian governing party, also in an increasing extent, the bilateral relationship with the United States is seen as a potential source of threat until there is a democratic administration. And very, very briefly, just two final remarks at the end. With regard to the constraining effect of the European Union, I think we should just be a bit more critical of it with the literature. Because actually, I think the largest part of the literature stems from a time when actually compliance of member states with joint European policies was much higher than over the past 5 to 10 years. Common foreign and security policy is still an intergovernmental policy field. I think the European Union largely anyhow operates according to the principles of now intergovernmentalism. And we see actually an increasing level of non-compliance with the requirements of hammering out joint foreign policy decisions. Obviously, we can't build a trend on Hungary. That's a matter of fact. But we see this increasing level of deviation, both with member states. Hungary is the primary example, but in some way also Poland or Italy could be mentioned here with increasing frequency. And we also see that in the case of candidate countries, actually. A condition of the membership would be acting in compliance in harmony with the common foreign and security policy. And we clearly have candidates like Serbia or Georgia, again, who pursue a rather multivectoral foreign policy, which very often disregards joint European positions. And when it comes to the case selection, I think it's just very interesting to see what different approaches can exist to a most similar or most different case design. I think the cases you selected are most different system designs based on populists in power. Because in the case of Hungary, you have a clearly nearly single-party ethno-populist government. Meanwhile, in the case of Austria, especially if you are focusing on Kurz and ÖVP, so the Austrian People's Party, I think you are not really measuring populist discourse, or at least the rhetoric of populist actors, but populist contagions on mainstream actors. So ÖVP, not even in populist or in other forms, is seen as a populist party, or it's definitely not more populist than the Republicans in France and the Christian Socialist Union in Bavaria. It's obviously a conservative mainstream party which from time to time uses populist discourse, but is not seen as a populist party per se, because the populist party is the Freedom Party of Austria, FPÖ, and potentially that could be an interesting counterpart as being a populist party in a minor coalition position. However, when it comes to the foreign policy of the two countries, I would argue that they are more similar system designs, because not necessarily the previous embeddedness in different
When it comes to what? I'm sorry?
When it comes to the international positions of the two countries, then I think these are most similar system designs, because they are, with some exceptions, only neighbored by NATO member states. They are not exposed to any direct security threat by authoritarian aggressive great powers, or at least that's their own official threat perception. If you ask an Austrian, if you ask a Hungarian government representative, I think they will clearly state that they don't see Russia as a threat. And this is actually which very much differentiates between ethno-populist impact on foreign policy in Poland, that they have this threat perception, while countries like Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria have another threat perception, which ultimately results, in the case of Austria, in the continuation of the traditional neutrality, and in the case of Hungary and Slovakia, in this multivectoral foreign policy, which makes these countries actually altogether free riders of the European security system. So I think there are much more commonalities in the foreign policy embeddedness, geopolitical position, threat perceptions of these countries than you write in the paper. And actually, I think from a foreign policy perspective, that makes them absolutely a more similar case design. But it's just really a comment on the case selection. And having said that, so once again, thank you so much for the opportunity that I could read your paper and comment it. And I will give the floor to you. Over to you.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen. I have some slides. All right. Looks good? Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to be discussant. I very much enjoy reading earlier iterations of Aaron and Mehmet's work, and so I'm excited to be discussing it now. So because this event is for a wide audience, I decided to not get too much into the nitty-gritty of the methods, even though I know that's why I was invited to be discussant. But while I'll keep my comments kind of broad in general, I'll email more specific comments that are maybe a little bit more critical directly to you and to Aaron and Mehmet. So you can have those separately. So I want to start with some of the ways that we've been using text analysis in AUTHLIB. I think this is helpful just to kind of frame the way, like, kind of how I think about this. So specifically, we've been interested in identifying the varieties of illiberalism, and using text analysis, we can see the different kinds of discourses that political elites use. And so actually some of this work is work that I've done with Mehmet on other projects in AUTHLIB. So he's familiar with some of this, and he's been using similar work with the paper that he presented with Aaron today. And so this figure that you're looking at is based on debates in Parliament. It's actually based on some of the same data that they presented for their paper. It's speeches by the Hungarian government between 2010 and 2022. And it looks basically at what kinds of words most likely occur together. We can see, and so doing that, we can see distinct discourses of illiberal subtypes. And I'll highlight some of those. And so first, there's what we call kind of uncivil or Manichaean discourse. This is framing politics as a struggle of good versus evil. Again, political opponents are the enemy. They're not someone to be negotiated with. It's much more stark than that. And so that's one type of liberal discourse. But we can also see a group of other discourses that appear to be interlinked that are separate from this more uncivil Manichaean good versus evil discourse. And so that's one over here is a kind of nationalist discourse that emphasizes terms like the homeland, motherland, pride, heritage, these kinds of things. And it's closely linked also then with a religious kind of discourse, church, God, Christ, these kinds of terms. And then also kind of mixed in with all of this is a more traditionalist discourse, like family, tradition, brothers, father, these kinds of terms. And so we can see, so using this kind of word embedding approach, which Mehmet's also using, we can see how these discourses cluster. And I think this is one of the main advantages of this approach. So we can use these clusters to measure the kinds of illiberalism that are more likely to define different policy areas, such as immigration, social policy, or gender, or different kinds of, in the paper's case, EU, Russia, immigration. And so this is me kind of looking inside the word embeddings to show what's going on inside the kind of model that Aaron and Mehmet are using in their approach as well. And so that's one advantage of this kind of approach. Another is that you can look at you can look at changes in positions over time on policy areas. So this looks at immigration. Again, in Hungary, we've clustered actors into government opposition. This is more the liberal opposition, though. Anyone who's from the center to the left. And then also Jobbik is we put Jobbik by itself because it's a rather unique actor. And you can see how there was a very clear split. And this is similar to, I think, what Mehmet found in his paper, a very clear split in 2015, from 2014 to 2015. This is in reaction to the, obviously, the Syrian refugee crisis, where the government becomes much more liberal on this topic and moves away from the opposition. But then Jobbik actually softens its position and moves towards the center and eventually joins the opposition. So again, you can get also leverage on time and change the position over time using these kinds of approaches. But so one of the main challenges, of course, with text analysis is distinguishing signal from noise, right? So language is messy. Just in everyday life, we know this is true. And so modern language mathematically, therefore, is fraught with challenges, especially when measuring concepts that overlap, right? So populism, nationalism, ethnopopulism, these have some kind of these share some qualities in their definitions that make it especially challenging to separate them apart. And so then we have to be especially careful of this when we're trying to develop measures for them. And so one approach to kind of making this distinction between signal and noise is to kind of decompose the word vector space to 2 dimensions and look at word clusters and look at word co-occurrence the way I showed in the previous figure. And so this allows us to look inside the model, look inside the word embedding space. And so does the way we're modeling and measuring language actually measure the things that we want it to? You know, do the word associations modeled in the word vector space make sense on an intuitive level, right? Because it should. If it's modeling language, we should be able to make some sense of it once we look inside it. Another approach for then kind of distinguishing signal from noise is to compare the results of text analysis with what I call gold standards for comparison, such as the Chapel Hill survey or CHESS. You know, this is a survey that asks country experts to score parties' positions on a range of issues, some that are shared with Mehmet and Aaron's studies on such as nationalism, populism, EU integration, but also many more. And so we can use comparisons with expert surveys like CHESS to get at external validity. You know, so how generalizable are the findings that we're getting from the text analysis, and how do they line up with other findings, research, and evidence outside of it? And so I wanted also to look at, I thought I would look at CHESS measures for nationalism, populism, and EU integration of some of the same actors as are in Aaron and Mehmet's paper, just to see how they compare. And so this looks at governments in the same 7 European countries. You can see the country and the year that's being measured. This kind of groups together sometimes it groups together some parties, sometimes it's just one party, like in Hungary, Fidesz. It's whoever was in power at the time. And this measures the level of nationalism of parties that participated in government according to CHESS, according to these expert surveys. And so on the nationalism scale, Hungary under Fidesz and Poland under PiS are the most nationalist, right? Which is not very surprising. And France's center-left coalition and Italy's five-star movement-led government are the least nationalist. So again, not very surprising so far. This is again some of the same countries, more recent because this measure doesn't go as far back in time, but looks at some of the same governments on and their score on populism. Here we see some different patterns though, right? So now the five-star movement is the most populist, and Macron's government is the least. Hungary again is pretty high, Austria is pretty high, and okay. Next one. So then I want to see how these two compare to each other, how these two axes compare. So this is an axis that compares nationalism and populism on an XY axis. And so if we look at the correlation between populism and nationalism, we can see there's quite a lot of correlation. However, there are some very clear outliers, right? So one is the Conte government led by the five-star movement, again, that I mentioned before, and the OVP and the Greens in 2019, right? So the Greens are somewhat populist, but not at all nationalist. So that brings the overall average of that government's kind of measured nationalism down, but it's still kind of high on the populism scale. But so otherwise, we see a pretty clear correlation. Well, like a very tight correlation, actually, between populism and nationalism otherwise. And so the takeaway I got from this is that nationalism and populism are distinct concepts, although they often correlate empirically. And we can see this reflected in the data in certain cases. And this means that our measures are working, right? So like in Italy, we know the five-star movement is not really a nationalist party. And so that we can see that. And so my question, which I couldn't quite see in the figures that you shared, was that using your measures for nationalism and populism, what similar kinds of patterns can we identify? So like which parties are more nationalist but not populist? Which parties are populist but not nationalist? Right? So what kind of leverage does this text analysis give us on these kinds of dimensions to make these distinctions between different types of parties? And are all parties that are high on both nationalist, so this is kind of a separate, more theoretical question. Are all parties that are high on both nationalist and populist measures also by definition ethno-populist? So can we combine these two? And in this case, look at this chart of nationalism and populism and say, okay, Hungary is the most ethno-populist. And if we somewhat aggregated this, then yeah, we know that. I'm just that's kind of I'm curious if these measures kind of combine in a nice kind of clean way or not. So I was also surprised by some of the findings about which countries emphasize sovereignty when it came to the EU, because there was this comment about in the paper as well about there being little distinction between liberal and illiberal actors. So I want to see what the chess data said about this topic as well. And so this is the scale measured EU position. It measures whether parties are for or against EU integration. And so it's organized by European governments by country and year. And so there are many observations. So I'll focus on the most pro and anti cases. So the most pro-EU integration countries are Central European countries in the early 2000s, according to the chess data. So Western European, so there are also some Western European countries, especially France and Austria, in this close to the top. And so this is, these are countries that were coming, like we can kind of explain this historically, these are countries that are coming still not long after the end of the Cold War, and so they're kind of motivated towards EU integration. Whereas on the other hand, the most anti-EU integration countries are Central European countries, especially Poland and Hungary from the past few years, and the UK as well. But but post and pre-Brexit, UK are pretty close to the low end of the scale, and are EU skeptic. Right, so we're looking at a number of EU countries that were originally, for historical reasons, much more interested in the project of European integration, and have more recently heavily soured on the idea. And we can see this in chess scores. And there also does appear to be a strong correlation between governments that are more nationalist and populist and Euroscepticism, right? The UK, Poland, and Hungary were also the most nationalist and populist governments, or some of the most nationalist and populist governments as well. So this is not terribly surprising, I thought, but does point to a clear confluence of factors in some of the countries that are turning away from global integration. And so what these measures, the chess scores, what the chess scores don't show is why exactly, or what aspects of European integration these actors are opposed to. So maybe in the UK, like, is this primarily about immigration? But I believe this is maybe a missed opportunity in your paper that I believe text analysis could provide a lot more insights on this point. I wonder, maybe in some, and so I'll ask you, maybe in some preliminary look at the data, if you've seen any evidence of what kinds of anti-EU discourses are most present in the text data. I'd be very curious to see that. I mean, and if you haven't done the work, I think that would be an excellent addition to the paper to kind of give it a bit more depth that combines the theoretical explanation with the operationalization of discourse. Okay, and then I just wanted to wrap up with some broad questions, actually. I think that this brings me closer to the end of my presentation. To recap, so based on your text analysis measures, which parties are more nationalist but not populist? Vice versa, which parties are populist but not nationalist? Are all parties that are high in both nationalist and populist measures also ethno-populist? And I really had a question about the sentiment around Russia, because that was quite surprising. And I was wondering if this had to do with, again, difficulties with the measurement. I know you were using the Warner et al. Paper, and I think that paper provides, I think she provides a few different kinds of dictionaries. So I was wondering which one in particular you were using, or if you could talk more about if you have some interpretation or understanding of why you were having difficulty measuring positive negative sentiment vis-a-vis Russia, or maybe you didn't think you did. That's kind of what I read into the paper. And then could we use this word embedding approach to identify what types of parties are more likely to be very pro-Russia or pro-China, right? So like what kind of parties are more likely to take this stance of moving against the EU and towards more authoritarian governments? Again, do we expect a correlation between ethnopopulism and this kind of behavior, or what's like what are the theoretical expectations of this? And that is everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dean, for your comments. And I would like to give back the floor to Erin and Mehmet to respond to the points and questions and comments raised. But in between, I also would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to submit your questions into the Q&A that we can also discuss at your points and your questions. So thank you. And Erin, Mehmet, we would like to start.
Thanks. I think we decided, Mehmet and I, that I would mostly deal with Daniel's comments, and Mehmet would mostly handle Dean's comments. Very great, in-depth, informational sort of like reactions. I think this is a great set of comments. I think I identified about 4 points that Daniel made in his commentary. And I think on the first 2 points, I kind of just agree. I agree that it's good to engage more in this puzzle of whether populist parties in power either moderate or radicalize. It has obvious foreign policy implications. And then also, secondly, the impacts on foreign policy, that's also critical, and it's not enough dealt with. Most of the focus on concrete policy impact is disproportionately on domestic level policy. I think this is a partly an outgrowth of the fact that most populist researchers have tended to be comparative politics and not IR scholars. And now that's changing. A lot more folks who are interested in security and IR are getting into looking at this animal of populist parties. What is it? Is it actually distinct from regular old parties in power? I think this Kaltwasser and Muda, thank you for the citation. I'll definitely look it up. This makes a lot of sense. Strength of constraints, absolutely. Constraints matter to the extent to which they can actually get their preferred policies pushed through. And by their preferred policies, it can be a range of things, but mostly, as you said in your introductory remarks, it's mostly about maximizing sovereignty, local sovereignty in the engagement of external relations in the state's diplomacy and its foreign policy and so on. So constraints obviously matter. The second point that you make about power of the populist parties, there is a small literature in foreign policy analysis. Mostly I'm thinking of Julie Carbo, who works on coalition politics and the impact that coalition politics have on foreign policy. I think it is a well-established, well-verified fact that these coalition dynamics matter, whether a party is a kingmaker or sort of like a bridge, obviously a small party like FPÖ can punch above its weight if it's kind of like holding the main party hostage with respect to kind of like the survival of the coalition. So, but still and yet, it's not the senior member of the coalition. So I absolutely agree with you. I think that it made a big impact that the far right populist party or the ethno-populist party in Austria was a junior member of the coalition, not the senior member as it was in Hungary. And I think that correlates perfectly with their responses to the GCM. Right, you have a kind of abstention of the vote in one case and the vote against in the other case. What I really wanted to focus on in your comments was this question about crisis, whether it's manufactured or whether it has some kind of objective existing sort of impact that's exogenous to the domestic politics at play in a country. I would argue that it's both. I think it's I don't think it makes sense to argue that it's one and not the other, since obviously the two go together. And if you look again at the diagram that I presented, there is this feedback loop, right? But I think if, this is where qualitative case analysis really helps us a lot here, because we can see that Kurz himself had a positive view of the GCM when he was a foreign minister. And he was pushed to the right by Heinz Christian Strache when they were, when the FPÖ and ÖVP were in a coalition government together. And what was happening in the lead up to that was, an incredible social media mobilization campaign on the part of FPÖ and all of their kind of like, opinion managers that really altered the kind of the discourse on this and pushed the government to such an extent that you can see that they were influenced by this, and not just by Strache, but also by kind of like this incredibly salient crisis that really changed the tone of the debate at the time. Similarly with Hungary, you had kind of like the pre-2015 mobilization, and the crisis that they were talking about was really about the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, and the crisis with mortgages that were being foreclosed on by banks, right? So there was also, it's true, a kind of focus on Brussels, but it was not about migration until the refugee crisis happened. And then all of a sudden you had this kind of like 360-degree sort of pivot towards everything is about, refugees. So clearly, you're right, they are drumming this up, but at the same time, they're also responding to these shocks that are penetrating society, not just at the elite level, but also at the kind of like the lateral sort of popular level. And then let's see, finally, migration is a low-hanging fruit. That's true. And yet this is where we can actually see a very clear impact. But yeah, like we could look further into other policies and geopolitics. I'm not sure if we can do that within this one single paper, right? This is already a lot for this one paper. And then finally, in case selection, I 100% agree with what you say. I mean, I was struggling with, whether this should be framed as the most similar systems design or most different systems design. My thinking was that really actually these countries are comparable, so very similar, and therefore there's unit homogeneity, and therefore the comparison makes a lot of sense here. We should expect to see populist governance play out in similar ways, but also that there are these important differences between them that make it interesting and fascinating to see a kind of a beginning of a convergence occur in a very punctuated way due to the punctuated populist governance in Austria, and in a more sort of like direct kind of like clear pivot in the case of Hungary, where you see the Fidesz has absolute supermajority control over the government. Thank you very much for these comments. They're excellent. I'm going to think about them more.
I will go ahead then. Well, thank you everyone for the wonderful comments. It's a lot of interesting discussion, a lot of food for thought, and thank you very much also for the brilliant preparation. I will respond to some of this. If I forget anything, please feel free to remind me. So on the point of Russia, like why we couldn't identify any substantive difference on like with positive discourse towards Russia, which as one would expect. So our starting point was that, in the journalistic work, maybe some of the attendees also engaged in this kind of work, we see a lot of discussion of pro-Kremlin actors in the far right, especially, but in populist radical right in general. So we wanted to see how systematic this is. And I think one problem we have is that we focused on the party as a whole, as Daniel mentioned, and maybe if we focus on the foreign minister, for example, during the ÖVP FPÖ government, and some MPs that are, let's say, in the public discourse perceived as pro-Russian, maybe we would see a different pattern. So I think our next step, and it's also interesting, I think, from an implication that we have to disaggregate. So maybe we should not see these actors as a unitary actor, and then we would see more things. Still, though, I think between 2018 and 21, we see a clear increase in pro-Russian discourse, which I still find remarkable. It could also be a technical issue, absolutely, about the dictionaries, because these negative positive dictionaries are produced by computer scientists, which, for example, would understand the word okay as a positive word. But if, for example, Europe is doing okay, if a politician mentions that, that's actually somewhat negative in the political discourse. But so we have to maybe fine-tune a bit the dictionary analysis as well. But my main response would be that, well, I think we need to disaggregate. And secondly, I mean, I really have to think about Daniel's point. Maybe this is not about friends per se, but more about enemies. And the friends possibly happens behind the doors, not in the parliament, but in terms of who funds which newspapers and so on. So maybe this should go more to the qualitative side, the pro-Russian attitude, and the quantitative, the anti-Europeanism is really what we should focus on. And I think there we see a clear trend. Which countries are, more nationalist, populist, and not together? I think we briefly highlighted this, but maybe we have to show this more systematically. I think what we find for sure is that in Central Eastern European countries, we see more nationalism, and pure populism or less nationalist populism happens more in Western Europe. I think that's what we find somewhat. And actually, one of the attendees just commented that this could be because of, well, you need more nationalism when you have more diaspora. So this, I would definitely subscribe to that, because in Central Eastern Europe, arguably, we have more diaspora living abroad than Western European countries. So I would say which countries are more nationalist, the Central European ones, based on at least what we identified so far. And the nationalist populist combination happens more in really illiberal parties that have been in the power for a long time, such as Poland and Hungary. And pure populism, I think we observe more in countries based on our analysis, such as France. Also on the liberal distinction, which is something you highlighted, and thank you for the brilliant analysis of the Chapel Hill survey. I think what we wanted to say so far was that in the extremes, these trends are clear. So we have Hungary and Poland as the most ethno-populist ones. And for example, in our analysis, this is something I didn't highlight, but in UK 2010 security document, which is produced by the Lib Dem conservative government, is the most liberal by far. So it's always on the liberal side systematically when it comes to nationalism, populism, ethno-nationalism. So I think with these extremes, it's clear. And with the values that are not so extreme, so documents that are a little bit populist, a little bit nationalist, we see both in populist and nationalist. We see both in liberal and illiberal parties. But maybe this is something we need to investigate more. And maybe perhaps we can include more documents. So I don't know if this was an implication of your comment as well, because there's just a data set. Actually, the US-based colleagues informed us that they systematized some NSS documents. So maybe we can incorporate more European countries. Also, if any one of you or any of the attendees have idea on what other policy documents we should focus on, we would really appreciate it as well. But I mean, we are also constrained by the comparability. So this is something we are constrained by. We have to have documents that are similar across contexts. Yeah, I think these would be my comments. And briefly on the Daniel's comment, yeah, I think that Dean also mentioned this. We have to focus more on FPÖ for sure, especially the Strache, for example, some of the actors within FPÖ. We wanted to focus on ÖVP to show the Kurz effect and the FPÖ contagion effect, but absolutely, FPÖ is something we have to dig into two more. We just thought it would be too obvious, but maybe that makes it more relevant by design.
Thank you so much, Irene and Mehmet, for these responses. And actually, we received a couple of questions, and you already partially answered a lot of them, especially those which relate to the case selection, and also those why, for example, there is a necessary disaggregation between populism and nationalism, and that these qualities are measured separately. But I think we still have time for a last round, and I just would like to drop two questions actually on the floor. One from Joel Enyedi, who is asking whether this methodology you use is actually good situated to potentially measure differences between foreign policies of ethnopopulist governments, which measure equally high on ethnopopulism, but, for example, have different strategic orientation with regards to NATO, Russia, and the main security challenges Europe is currently facing. And the second question, it's more related to basic definitions, comes from Franziska Bühne, who is asking actually what was your concept of liberalism and illiberalism, what you used in the categorization of the different governments. And I think this relates mostly to the part in the research of national security strategies. So I don't know.
Maybe I could jump in.
Yeah, sure.
I could jump in on the populism nationalism question, because I think this also does the comment or question that Dean asked, which is, you know, which parties are more nationalist but not populist. And so, you know, part of this is coming from work that I co-authored with or worked with Bruno Constanjo Silva and Kirk Hawkins on their global populism database. We also had, you know, these are basically foreign executives, so prime ministers and presidents and their speeches. So this is sort of looking at, you know, the extent to which in a kind of a quota of speeches during a period of, during one government, whether there are relatively high levels of populism versus low levels. And we also had, you know, trained up experts who hand coded whether there was a lot of nationalism versus populism. And, you know, when they coincide, typically you do see a sort of a certain signature of ethnopopulism, where basically the nation is also the people, as Mehmet talked about. Whereas if you see nationalism without populism, you don't have this kind of like revolutionary impulse. A lot of it is just, it's very consistent with kind of mainstream kind of positions towards allies. It might just be about border security, you know, territorial sovereignty. This is where you can get sort of conflicts with neighbors, such as irredentist conflicts. But this isn't necessarily going to also involve conflict with sort of like allies, with like international organizations, with alliance structures, which is very sort of consistent with a much more populist type of revolutionary rhetoric. And this is what we're seeing much more in the last like 10, 15 years, this combination, than in previous periods. So speaking of, can you have populist parties but not, you know, see much nationalism typically? And this is not just in parliamentary speeches, but also in the executive speeches. Czechs and Italians tend to be much more kind of like populist than nationalist. And then typically you have much more nationalism by countries like France, right? You know, countries that are much more sort of pro kind of national security, but also kind of very much strongly in favor of allies and sort of like preserving like alliance commitments. And you see that reflected in their rhetoric. So that's what they look like separately, and then together it's basically like, you know, you have the Brussels, and they're using like illegal immigrants, and they're conspiring against the people nation, and they're doing this enemies within and this global conspiracy. So there's all this conspiracy theories and all of this other stuff. I think the rhetoric of ethnopopulists is quite distinctive and fairly easy to pick up on if you're listening to the kinds of things that they say. And maybe, Mehmet, you want to say something about the liberal, illiberal? Like, we struggled a bit with this.
So yeah, yes, my microphone is on. So I mean, I think follow the general findings of the AUTHLIB project, but also the expert surveys, which identifies clearly what is liberal, what is illiberal. But I think if we were to define illiberalism, which we do in the paper implicitly, it's a set of anti-pluralist rhetoric that is against the liberal domestic and international order. So, but following this, we, for example, treat Fidesz as an illiberal government, PIS as an illiberal government. And this, I think, we borrow from both the AUTHLIB project and general expert surveys. So this is where we make the distinction, which also is a bit, you know it when you see it kind of definition, but I think the analytical difference from like the binary difference between liberal and illiberal is somewhat clear. That is not to say that, however, liberal governments do not use illiberal rhetoric and illiberal governments do not use liberal rhetoric. It's just that when we look at systematically, we can differentiate as such. And should I also answer the Jolt's yeah. So I think, as Dean greatly showed, the discourses on the ideological side are consistent, but the targets might differ when we compare different actors. So if we compare these consistent ideological discourses with Russia, Europe, NATO, so with different liberal target terms, I think we would be able to identify the different international orientations. It's just that we should not analyze them in the same way. So if we, for example, analyze how Meloni and Orbán use nationalism against Europe, maybe we would already identify that they are not the same. But then we have to look at the other dimensions. For instance, NATO, then we can identify whether actually, yeah, Meloni also has illiberal associations with liberal international order. So the targets we have to look at should be different. And that's also why we suggest that we should focus on meso-level practices and should not treat them as populist international. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Irene and Mehmet, for these responses. I think we are slowly approaching the end of our event. I don't know whether any of you or Dean just would like to use the time for a final comment. If it's not, Erin, please go ahead.
Maybe just quickly to Mela, if Mela is still here in the Q&A. A great comment. I copied the whole comment, and I will be thinking about this more. She was asking if we could say something about why we chose these cases. So yeah, I acknowledge that our case selection could be justified a little bit better. I do think, though, that this is a nice comparison, not only for the reasons that we talked about, but also for the fact that they both basically experienced the same sovereign shock at the same time. So it also kind of lets us look at the ways in which this sort of influenced these different kind of illiberal governments differently or similarly, depending on, you know, which populist parties are in power, where they're sitting in the government. And I think a process tracing approach is nice for this, especially if you can kind of show that there's a connection with the policy choice at the end.
Thank you so much. Mehmet?
I think there is one last comment we didn't respond, and maybe I can briefly touch upon that. Arlette Lawrence comments on how to counter the exploitation. I think our method actually exactly enables this, because yes, they might all mention the democratic values, the democracy, but they might not associate them with pluralist terms, but illiberal terms. So I think to encounter, we have to identify the patterns. And if we already find that the word democracy is not associated with the word plural or the word rule of law in the Orbán's case compared to Rishi Sunak's case, we already see a difference. So we already identified the difference. I think we have to look at which words they associate with, which can be done perfectly with this natural language processing or text analysis tools we follow.
Thank you so much. Erin, Mehmet, thank you for the presentation and all the food for thought you provide us today. Dean, thank you for the excellent comments and the points raised. And ladies and gentlemen, also many, many thanks for being with us today. And we hope that we can welcome you again by our next AUTHLIB online workshop or paper presentation. I wish you a nice day and see you next time. Bye.